Welcome back to Whiskey and Wine, where we dive into the world of whiskey and wine and make it a little bit more approachable for more people. Let's get into it. So, today we are chatting about how to read a label. And what I mean by that, how to take a look at this label and know what in the world am I buying? Is this something that I want? Is it not something that I want? What is this? Obviously, if you've had it before, you're not even going to question what's on label. You're going to go look for that same looking label, maybe buy the wrong one because they all look very similar. You're gonna grab it, walk away, call it a good day. So why do you need to know how to read a label? Basically, it's going to help you be a more educated buyer and also a more educated consumer so that you can actually get what you want and not buy something else. So, what's on a label? In the US, we have some very specific requirements on what has to be slash should be on a label. For the most part, every single distillery, every single producer is going to follow these rules. So you need to have your brand name, the class type designation, name and address of where it was distilled and bottled if they're different, the ABV, the health code warning, as well as the net contents. If you've got those things, you're good to go. So the first one, brand name. Example, we're looking at this one, we have Benchmark is going to be your brand, and then they have the type designation of bonded straight Kentucky bourbon whiskey. For the Rebel over here, that's going to be, again, the brand name, and then they have the type class designation of straight Kentucky bourbon whiskey. Now, most brands are always going to have like their sub type on it. So for Benchmark, for example, you're going to have full proof or top floor or small batch or bonded. I think they have a 8 year or 12 year, something like that. That's kind of going to help you understand as well what's in that bottle. And because we're in the US, you can't put something on the label that is going to be misleading. So if this was only aged for, say, 6 years, you can't say, oh, this is a 9. You can't do that. If this wasn't actually whiskey, you can't say, hey, this is straight Kentucky bourbon. You have to accurately describe what's in the bottle on the label. You can't mislead. That is part of our law, and it makes it a little bit easier for us to actually get what we want. The next thing you're going to see is the location it was distilled and bottled. So for this guy, it says that it was distilled and bottled and aged in the Buffalo Trace distillery. Whereas the Rebel, it's going to be somewhere else, obviously. So this one was distilled and aged in Kentucky for Bardstown Lux Row Distillers. That's just on there so you know where you're getting the product. If it was aged like at a different location, they'll need to say that. For example, Four Roses has this where they actually have two different places where they can age. And they'll need to tell you where was this aged. And they typically will go a little bit further, especially if it's a single barrel. They will tell you exactly what warehouse it was aged in, the location within the rick house, all that stuff. But if it's not a single barrel, they're not going to tell you all that information. Most places, even if it is single barrel, they don't tell you that. So that's one of the things that makes Four Roses a little fun. From there, you're going to have the health code, and that's always going to be on every single alcoholic beverage. They have to have the health code. Not sure if it's outside the US as well. I'm guessing it is, but within the US, you have to have this health code on there, this warning. Any alcoholic beverage you've looked at in the US, you've seen this. So that just has to be on there by law. And then you have the net contents, which is always in metric, and the ABV, or the alcohol by volume. And especially with whiskey, you're going to see where they don't always just have the ABV, they're also going to have the proof. So, for example, the bottle and bonded over here, this is going to say 150% ABV. If you have the ABV, double it. That's going to be proof is not required, but a lot of bourbons, a lot of whiskeys will always tell you what the proof is. Just something that they need. So those are the only things that are required, but there's going to be a lot of other advertisement basically on the label that's going to make you want to buy it. So what are those things that you're going to see? Those are going to be things like non-distiller produced. So someone like Jefferson's over here is a technically non-distiller produced because they didn't distill this themselves. This was distilled at a different distillery, but they bottled it, and now it is their bourbon. Doesn't really change what's going on, but it does help you know that, hey, this might taste just like someone else's whiskey because they're actually the ones that distilled it, but they let someone else buy it in bulk and bottle it for. Another big one is going to be flavored whiskey, which isn't bourbon, but like this guy, which is whiskey with natural lavender flavor. It's a little interesting. There are a lot of these outside the US that people judge, but it's still good for what it is. Just know that it's not going to be like this guy. It's not going to be this heavy hitting bourbon. It's going to be something a little bit lighter, a little bit sweeter. It's going to have some different flavors to it because that's the point. It's a flavored whiskey. And technically, these are going to be considered a distilled spirit specialty or a liqueur, is basically what they are. Another thing that's becoming bigger and bigger is going to be finishing. So, what finishing means is basically taking what you have, this bourbon, and then putting it into another barrel that was already filled. What that allows it to do is extract some flavors, and it's going to taste a little bit. So, this one specifically is going to be Angel's Envy Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey finished in port wine barrels. So, they took some empty port wine barrels, filled it up with their bourbon, let it age for some amount of time, and now they've got this. So, again, technically, this is no longer a bourbon because it was not only in a new charred oak barrel. So that's why they have to have that full, lengthy description of this is straight Kentucky whiskey or bourbon that was finished in port wine barrels. And they're also going to see some other things where it's double oaked or oak finished. Now, what that means is they took another new charred oak barrel and dumped the whiskey into it. Technically, that's still bourbon because it was only in new charred oak. So it's just going to be a lot more oaky flavor. There's going to be some different things you can do there. It's a lot of fun, but if you don't like oak, probably don't try the double oaks. There are some other labels on the label that you're going to see that give you a little bit more view into what is in your bourbon. Those are going to be things if it's straight, bottle and bond, sweet mash, sour mash, single barrel, cask strength, small batch, different things like that. Now, what do all those things mean? So, if it's straight, that just means it was aged and, excuse me, that just means it was distilled and aged for at least 2 years within that location of distinction. You're also going to see these with like Tennessee or Texas, and I'm betting you're going to see it popping up for a lot of other places as it becomes a little bit more popular. So, really, any place can do it, just depends if they're going to. And a lot of places, things will be, say, like in Indiana, straight, but don't put that distinction on there. You don't really need to. From there, you're going to see things like bottle and bond as well, which is going to have even more rigorous requirements for it. So this guy, the bonded from Benchmark, is bottle and bond. Since it has bonded on it, it kind of keys us in that it should be bottle and bond. And if it wasn't, there could be some legal repercussions on that. Because I mean, there would be, but there could be, because in the US, you have to accurately label what is in that bottle. So if you said, again, if you said this was bonded, but it wasn't actually bottle and bond, it might run into some problems. Or if you said this was finished in new charred oak or finished in port wine, but it was actually finished in sherry, you might run into some issues there. Like I mentioned before, the next couple big ones you're going to see are going to be things like small batch, single barrel, and cask. So, small batch is when you take a couple of barrels, there's no technical number for how many barrels this needs to be. And then you take those barrels, you dump them together, send it out. Single barrel, on the other hand, it has to be a single barrel. You can dump that into your bottling, good to go. You can water these ones down or proof it down if you need to, but some places do, some places don't. If they don't, you'll typically see the next distinction of barrel strength or cask strength, which means they did not proof it down. It has been whatever was in the barrel at, that's what's going into your bottle. So obviously be aware of that because that can be pretty high proof sometimes. So the last two that you'll see every now and then are going to be things like sweet mash or sour mash. So looking at something with a sour mash distinction, all that means is that when they were doing their distillation process, whatever was left over at the end, the stillage or the leftover grains and everything, water mixture, they take that and they put it back into the next round of fermentation to help kickstart it and keep some flavor profiles as well as some other benefits. All my lights just decided to go out in the middle of shooting. Sounds fun. Anyways, where were we? Sour mash, sweet mash. Yeah. So for sour mash, they just take that leftover grain water mixture and they put it back into the fermentation. There's a lot of benefits to that, but I'll have another video getting into why people do that. The other side of it is going to be sweet mash, which they don't do that. They always use fresh ingredients. They have to clean out everything, make sure it's nice and sterile, and then restart. Does this have to be on there? No. Basically, all of these are going to be sour mash. They are not sweet mash. I only know that because most distillers do not do sour mashes, or excuse me, do not do sweet mash. There are very specific ones that do sweet mash right now, and sour mash is just a little bit easier to do, basically. So, like this guy doesn't have sour mash, doesn't have sour mash. Doesn't mean they're not sour mash. Doesn't mean it's not sweet mash, but you have to kind of look into it if you really want to know what it is. But for the most part, if you need to know if it's sweet mash or sour mash, most of the distillers will have that on their website or it's pretty easily accessible. Now, there's a little bit of information that most buyers want to know that is not easily accessible. And that's going to be what is the mash bill. So the mash bill is the recipe that goes into making the whiskey or the bourbon. And that, well, we know for one, if it says bourbon, we know it has to at least be 51% corn. But they don't tell you really anything past that, and it's kind of hard to find it sometimes online. You can key into it a little bit by knowing how to, again, read the label and knowing that these labels have to be accurate. So for the Rebel here, we know that this one says wheated on it. So the next grain after the corn has to be wheat. That's going to be that next highest percentage. And then I'm guessing the next one is going to be malted barley just because that's kind of how bourbon works. But as far as the percentages, we don't know. You can do a little bit of Google searching to figure that out, but it's not always easily accessible. I'm trying to put together a giant document of all of the mash bills that I'm aware of. And then as I keep coming across more, I'll keep adding to that so that we can know, hey, this has 51% corn, 30% rye, and then the rest of the malted barley, or this has 10% rye. I don't like things that are below 10% rye, whatever it may be. It just kind of helps you know, are you going to like this whiskey? Are you not going to like this whiskey? Is it super important, really, in the long run? Not necessarily, especially if you're someone who likes to taste around and try new things. Grab it and try it and see how it goes. You can see this guy's pretty full still. I'm not the biggest wheated fan, so I like this one, but I'm not going to drink it quite as quickly as something that is going to be a high rye. So it does benefit to know about it, but I wouldn't say you should put all of your eggs in one basket with mash bill because there are a lot of other things that can happen that are going to change the flavor profile of your bourbon or your whiskey. So that is a long-winded explanation for what's on your label, but as always, I hope you learned something and I hope this helps you out on your journey. Glad you're here. Cheers.